And we are back for another installment of the Artisans of the Horizon conversation series with different change makers and artisans and activists and dreamers and just people who are trying to make the world a little bit more of a beautiful place. And today I have the Reverend Dr. Sid Hall, who is the lead minister of Trinity Church in Austin. And I suspect that we're going to have a really lively conversation. And so, Sid, would you like to share as our opening some thoughts about who you are and how you show up in the world?
Sure. Like you said, I'm lead minister at Trinity Church of Austin. It's a church that is affiliated with the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, and Creation Spirituality Communities. And I've been here for 32 years now, and we have been creation centered since for about 30 of those years. And we're a church that from the very beginning set out to experiment and be creative and try to figure out how to do things differently than the conventional wisdom dictated back in the day. And I think that spirit of experimentation is a part of my own DNA, and it is also a part of the church's. One of the things that we do, and one of the things that I do, is I figure you're going to try lots of things that don't work. But every once in a while, one will work, and it will really work. And so why not try lots of things and then land wherever you land? So that's kind of my general life philosophy and how I try to do things.
I love that because that really showcases what it means to be an artisan or an artist. And this whole series is about showcasing people who are daring to do that. And one of the things that first comes up about this, what you just said, and what I've noticed in the different people that I've had on this series, is that every single person that I have showcased so far has really either vocally or subconsciously affirmed that part of building the horizon, of creating the horizon and what's beyond the horizon is about experimentation, about being available to the experience, to the moment. But it's also about taking risks and being okay with taking risks. And can you speak to that about, what is it, the spirituality of risk taking and how you really see that in your work?
Well, I've always had a creative imagination, but risk taking is something I had to learn. There's one of my favorite images that I hold is my parents took little family movies of me and my sisters when we were young, and I was the oldest, and it shows me going out onto a high dive for the first time when I was maybe 5 years old, and I get up to the top of the ladder. I realize how high up it is. I crawl up onto the board, crawl down to the end, put my legs over the edge, and sit there for a long time. And while my father is saying, you can hear him through the camera, "You can do it. Come on, you can do it." And finally, after what seemed like forever, I reluctantly scooted off the edge and dropped down into the water. My sister, who's 2 years younger than me, went flying up the ladder, got to the top of the diving board, looked out, threw her arms up, ran down, and flew into the water. And so when people know me today, they know me as in the reputation of being an activist, of experimentation, and they just assume that I've always been like that. But I sort of see myself as not so much an activist, but a recovering placater. I'm a person who learned early on in my own family system what it took to get along and to do what was necessary to get along. And so risk-taking for me came when my conscience pushed up against that fear. And I either had to move with conscience or had to do something else. And I don't think I would have stayed in ministry had I could not have found a way to be a risk taker theologically, politically, spiritually, etc.
Yeah, and one of the cool things about that is, you and I are both a part of creation spirituality communities, and we come out of that tradition of creation spirituality. One of the things I often talk about when I talk about CS is, we talk about the four paths all the time. And I always bring up that each one of the four paths gives birth to the other path. And within each path resides the seeds for the next path. And the negative path, or the path of the shadow, is what gives birth to the creative path, or the path of expression, as I like to call it. And I think your story really illustrates that. It affirms that reality that when you confront the shadow or the darkness or the fear, and you see that it's an opportunity for creativity, for daring, for going into a different angle, not only do you tap into creativity for yourself and you get to experience that and express that energy, it initiates other people into wanting to do the same. And that's how you create the fourth path of transformation, of social justice, of activism. And I feel like for me, that's really kind of what ministry is all about, is about learning to play with those shadows, to not worry about being in the light or even being in the dark, but having a beautiful interweaving of the two. And then that ultimately is what empowers other people to say, oh, I can do that too. And let's go do that in the public forum, and also confront all those things that keep us from doing that, including—
I agree. Yeah. And most of my risk-taking, when it came to sort of entrepreneurial aspects of ministry or activism, I have done as calculated risks. I feel like that if I were a lone wolf, some of those rules wouldn't apply. But as a pastor of a community, I am charged with respecting those people, whether they agree or disagree with me, which means I can't just be like a bull in a china closet. I have to move with respect and help bring people along that may not be where I am at the moment, and that requires a certain patience. And so for instance, when my congregation voted in 1992 to be the first Methodist church at that time only, the first Methodist church in the area to become LGBTQ welcoming, what's called reconciling in the Methodist tradition. I kept a file for 2 years while I was talking about it, of church members' names, and one row in that file said yes, another said no, and another said maybe. And I had many conversations. I had preaching series. I brought in speakers. I brought in people to teach classes. And over that period of time, I watched that the no's moved to maybes or yeses. And when it got to 80%, not just 51%, but when it got to 80%, then I said, we're ready to vote. That's a calculated risk. And then, of course, the people on the outside, people in the city and people in the neighborhood, and especially in the hierarchy of the Methodist Church, they didn't know all that was going on. All they see is the big newspaper front page article that says Methodist Church votes to do such and such, and they're like, wow. Well, they didn't know that there was a movement of respect and process behind the scenes. And I think that that's sometimes missing from the narrative of risk taking. It doesn't mean that the risk is any less of a risk. It just means that there are smart ways to do things, and there are not smart ways to do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, in process theology, we talk a lot about the idea of that God is certainly in the event, or the sacred is certainly in the event, and that the event itself is sacred and embodies divinity. But process theology really asks more the questions of what are the characteristics, the qualities, the modalities that need to be present in order for an event to take place. And really seeing the sacred in that, and how those particles come together, and those atoms and neutrons come together to form something, and so yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's a good point in regards to risk taking. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So tell me about this whole idea of being an artisan or being an artist. How do you feel that Trinity has really taken that and embodied it as a congregation, or maybe you as a pastor? And how do you think that that's affected the world around you, or maybe just the city around you?
I really like Matthew Fox's emphasis on how everyone is an artist, everyone is a prophet,
Mm-hmm.
everyone is a mystic. And so I have taken that seriously and have communicated that in the congregation, saying, you all are artists in your own way. You may not be visual artists, you may not be dancers, you may not be poets, but there's something unique in artistry that you bring to the world and to this community that is absolutely necessary, and that has its own angle that no one else in the community can provide. Mm-hmm. And the same is true of the sense of the mystic. They may not have all had experiences as dramatic as Paul's Damascus Road or Black Elk's vision, but I guarantee you that every one of them knows what it's like to experience awe and wonder at a sunset, at the beauty of a relationship, of what it means to see firsthand deep compassion. Those things bring a sense of awe. And so trying to help them get in touch with their own mystical sense has been part of that process. And then the prophetic. It's not just enough to experience union with the divine, but mm-hmm. How do you take that to the streets? How do you yourself become part of the process of as a change agent in the world? And so it takes courage. And so I sort of see I think that those three things have been goals of mine in weaving community and trying to find ways to celebrate that and help people see that they're probably already those things. Mm-hmm. They may not have thought of themselves as a mystic, but when you share what that is, they go, oh yeah, I guess I am. Prophetic is a little harder. Yeah. Sometimes they have the conscience, but they don't have the courage. Yeah. And so helping them find the courage to step out, to speak out, to advocate, to be an ally, those are learned behaviors, but you can do that in a community in a way that you don't often feel the support as an individual. So that's how I think the artisan um, spirit has worked for me. Is trying to accentuate those three core tenets of creation spirituality.
Yeah, and I like also to point out to people in regards to like being prophetic is sometimes because we're not taught in our society that being prophetic is virtuous or valuable because it doesn't bring us profit, it doesn't make our bank account larger, or increase our amount of followers online. Um, Oftentimes, when we practice the prophetic, which is a practice, and a vocation, we when we practice it, it sometimes appears to us to be kind of pathetic,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of, I think, the vocation of the prophet, because it goes back to like what Paul talked about being fools for Christ. The world calls us foolish, calls us absurd, says we're wasting our time, um, or whatever, because we're investing our energies into trying to help people be more human, which is ultimately what the practice of religion and spirituality is supposed to be. Help us to know and tools to live more humanely in the world, to walk more gently on this planet. Um, and
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think that one of the risks of being a prophet is that you're going to get it wrong.
yeah,
And so back to that philosophy that I talked about of trying different things. Um, if we get something wrong and we're the only one that sees it, um, um, then we don't. It's not a big deal. If I if I say, oh, I can fix this this problem that I have at home with a I'll just get out a Phillips head screwdriver. I could tighten that up and it'll work. And if I tighten it and I've got the wrong Phillips head and I end up stripping it, no one else sees that except me. Um, when you step out and take a position, you might be wrong, and um, and and you will have the significant pushback depending on how public it is. And I think that stops a lot of people from taking that risk because what if I get it wrong? Well, you're going to get it wrong sometimes, and it's important at that point to be humble and say, "I'm sorry, I did not get that right," and work to get it right the next time. And so the prophetic is risk taking in a different manner. You know, the truly prophetic, deeply prophetic, can lead to risks such as harm, being arrested, even death.
yeah,
Um,
mhm,
and so I try to remind myself that when I'm taking a stand on something, it's not usually going to lead to something like that.
yeah,
Sometimes it does. Uh, I've been arrested, and you have too. You know what that's like to have that happen, and sometimes it can be a little scary. But generally speaking, the biggest risk is that I might embarrass myself
yeah.
for not getting something exactly right. So,
Yeah, and it is challenging. That's why I do like to say that being a prophet is a practice, for many, many reasons. But yeah, we can get something wrong. I think of my good friend Ray Hill, who's a very prominent LGBT activist in Houston, who's no longer alive. He died a few years ago. Um, he he became kind of, well, he was already a very prominent LGBT leader. He was one of the original organizers for the first March on Washington for
oh wow,
LGBT rights. Yeah. He's mentioned on Wikipedia. um, and it was in the 70s, I think, was when that was. And anyway, he in Houston, we had kind of our own version of the Matthew Shepard incident with a guy named Paul Broussard, which I don't know if you remember.
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Ray was really at the head of that case and trying to get the people who were involved in his murder convicted and all that. And he was successful in getting them to be sent to jail. Later on, a few years later, there was some evidence that came out um, that proved that it was not a hate crime per se, and that some of the people who were involved or who they thought were involved were not actually involved. And so he spent actually the rest of his life trying to mend that thing that he did, and it was a big mistake. And he admitted it. He always said that was his biggest regret. But he said that in his devotion to justice, he was able to develop a very close relationship with that man. And they wrote together back and forth all the time. And he worked really, really hard to try to get him out. He's still in jail. I don't know if he'll ever get out, but it's one of those instances where, yeah, you make mistakes, but it's what you do with your mistakes that matter. And he really did try to, one of the things that he's well known for saying is, you get up every morning, you put your pants on, and you go into the world and you try to do whatever it is that you can to ease the world a little bit closer to justice and peace.
Yeah, I think that the risk, the potential for harm of not doing anything is much greater than trying something and then not getting it exactly right.
Yeah.
My doctoral work was in Holocaust studies, so that had a big influence on my ministry and my activism, and simply just reading and hearing account after account of well-meaning people who remain silent when and out of fear that of retribution, when they needed to speak up. But then, of course, you read about those that chose to speak up anyway, and they have been my inspiration. There's a woman named Eva Fogelman whose father was rescued by a baker in a small town in Eastern Europe when the Nazis rolled into town, and he just happened to be in this baker's shop, and the baker said, hide behind the oven, which was very hot. He says, they won't look there. And this baker risked his life and his family's life to save this young boy. And so somehow this boy and later man survived the war, and his daughter was Eva Fogelman, a sociologist, and she became fascinated not by why people remain silent, but what was it about the people who chose to not remain silent? How did they do that? What was their motivation? And that book has inspired me, and I try to live up to that when that fear grips me. I had an incident that happened when I was in 4th or 5th grade where a girl that lived down the street from me had some brain damage from a heart condition, and she when she was a little child, she had surgery, and there was some oxygen that was cut off. And anyway, it left her just a little awkward. She was slower in school than everybody else, but she was smart enough to know that she wasn't as quick as everyone, which was really hard. And she was easily provoked when people made fun of her, and that happened all the time on the bus. She was my age. We lived down the street from each other. We played together when we were little. She was my friend. But every day on the bus, on the way home from school, I remained silent while some of my buddies made fun of her. And one day they did something. I don't know what they did to provoke her, but they did. And I laughed. She was dropped off maybe 5 houses before me. And the bus pulled around the corner, went down the hill. By the time it got to my driveway, I'm looking out the front of the bus, and my mother is standing at the end of the driveway. My mother is never standing at the end of the driveway. She's standing there with her arms crossed, just staring at the bus. And as I get off the bus to walk around in front of it to get in the driveway, she is wagging her finger at me and saying, "Do you know why I'm standing here, young man?" And I said, "No." And of course I knew why. She said, "I just got a call from this girl's mother. She said you were making fun of her." And I said, "I wasn't making fun of her. All I did was laugh." And she said, "Oh, that is making fun. This conversation is over." And of course, all these kids are staring at the windows of the bus at me and watching this whole thing. I was terribly embarrassed. But my mother said, "I want you to march over there right now, young man, and apologize to her and apologize to her mother." I remember saying, "Her mother," and she says, "Her mother, go, this conversation's over." And as I walked across the field between our houses, and it was one of those dreams where you're trying to run from a tiger and your legs won't move. I just felt like I was made of lead. And my mother is yelling behind me, "Faster! You can walk faster than that." And I went over and, of course, apologized to her mother and she was very forgiving. Her mother said, "You should be sorry because you really hurt her feelings." Well, I never forgot that. And I feel like that there's almost an atrophy or gravity of dropping that by default we are compliant to bullies and to harm, even when we know otherwise. And that there's a conscience inside that can tell us otherwise. My mother planted that conscience in me. And I felt like that, yes, when I was in 4th grade, it was her voice at my back saying, "Faster, you can go faster than that." But as an adult, I felt like it was the Spirit that is at my back saying, "Faster, Sid, you can go faster than that." And that's what it means to be an ally. That's what it means to speak up. And it may be that no one else can do it. It may be that it's dependent on you in that moment, at that time, to be that one. And that's just been very powerful for me.
That's such an amazing story. Did you end up still being friends with her?
Yes. Oh yeah. She was incredibly forgiving. She was like, you know, I stayed friends with her because she forgave me. That's why. And so yes, it was. I really hurt her, and her mother was hurt that I would not stand up for her. Never forgotten that. It's when I'm asked to speak up on behalf of Black Lives Matter as a white person, when I'm asked as a straight person to be an ally for LGBTQ people, when I'm asked as a male to be a part of the Me Too movement and to own my own part of that, I think of that voice at my back. Faster, you can go faster than
that. That's such a great story, and it makes me think of the divine feminine. That the divine feminine always does that. It always tells us you can go faster, pushes us forward, doesn't really give us an opportunity to struggle in it. It just pushes us forth and kind of nags us into doing what's right. And
Oh yeah.
I just think that's so cool. That's such a great
Yeah,
story.
I mean, sometimes the divine feminine can be the nurturing mother, but
Mhm.
sometimes it can be the warrior mother that's saying, "Get off your butt. You're not doing what you should be doing,
Yeah,
uh, and I'm not going to take it. So go." Um, yes, that's the divine feminine as well.
yeah, yeah. That's so cool. That's such a great story. Yeah, and it also reinforces the reality that sometimes, well, the third point that Matt says that everybody is a prophet, um,
Yeah,
but sometimes we have to be reminded of that. I think our souls know that, but sometimes we have to be reminded by um, our parents, by our pastor, by maybe other friends. We have to be pushed into it, and so your story really illustrates that.
yeah. Eva Fogelman says that in studying doctors, partisans, social workers, um, soldiers, even children that became allies of Jews during the Holocaust. The one thing that was a common denominator is that all of them were raised at some very deep, profound level with the idea that you should do unto others as you would have them want them to do unto you. Um, and she said, it's no more profound than that. That's it. And that's a very but that's the voice of the prophetic within us, and Jesus and Hillel and Lao Tzu and uh, you know people from many traditions have called on that ethic as a core part of our spiritual self, and says that you can believe whatever you believe, but the rubber hits the road right here, and 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 um, and that's what Fogelman saw, um, and of course was grateful because she wouldn't have existed had there not been some baker who didn't even know her father that risked his own life to take care of him.
Yeah, and I like to talk about having all of us have biases of some kind, because partly that's what happens in the society that we are raised in, and society that teaches us to always try to one up each other. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I often like to say, well, if we're going to have biases, why don't we have a bias towards caring? Uh, you know, like why don't we have a bias towards leaning into having a high regard for people, um, or just always knowing that maybe people need just a little bit more space. That's one of the beautiful insights that I think I have taken away from this really horrific pandemic is that um, space can really save lives. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Making it some distance between you and another person can create an avenue for grace to take over, um, which is my
That's a good point.
favorite. Yeah, my the Second Vatican Council defined the sacraments as avenues of grace, um, and I think that idea of being in the sacramental universe, there are when you have that type of hermeneutic, you can see those avenues of graces in the space between you and other people, wearing a mask, uh,
Yeah.
honoring the pronouns that people want you to use.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that maybe if you're in a group and you're a male, that you probably tend to speak a little bit more. So why don't you take a step back? These are all ways of having avenues of grace, being a sacramental universe, or really ways of practicing stepping into the the um, the cosmic story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think anthropologically, outside of religion, but just from a pure anthropological perspective, uh, our ancestors, were xenophobic by nature because they didn't trust people that looked different, talked different, acted different, and that was probably a survival technique. But they also learned that within their own clan, it couldn't always be about themselves. It had to be about honoring each other. And I think that the modern world, where those clans push up against other clans more, where our own clan pushes up against others, our stretch is to take that same sentiment that we took for those within our own circle and expand it to those that we naturally see as other. And the Buber's I and thou, and to expand that circle as we grow. But I think that is something we have to grow into. But I think that it can also be taught and to children and to in community and my own community, my own progressive community of Trinity. I don't have to talk to them about being activists. I don't have to encourage them to be supportive of Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ inclusion, those kinds of things. They do that. I don't. Earth Day, every Sunday is Earth Sunday, practically, because there are so many environmental activists. But there is a tendency among us, among people on the left, to see those fundamentalist Christians, especially, as enemies. And I think it's important to see the face of God in people that differ from us. There's a wonderful story that Kathleen Norris tells in her book, The Cloister Walk, a story that she heard at one of the Benedictine monasteries about an old abbot that was constantly emphasizing to all the people in the monastery that you need to greet every stranger who comes to the gate as Jesus Christ himself. And that was hard work because not everyone was easy to see as Christ. And one day, one of the young monks said to the abbot, "Father, do you ever tire of greeting everyone who comes to the gate as Jesus Christ himself?" And he looked at him and he says, "Son, I have to admit, every once in a while, I see another person walking through the gate. I have to ask myself, Jesus Christ, is that you again?" And of course, the answer is always yes. So that means that even those of us who are committed to inclusiveness have to, like you said, own up to the shadow, that path to creation spirituality. And the shadow for people who are progressive are how we tend to demonize and choose not to see the face of the divine in those with whom we disagree.
Yeah, and part of welcoming is knowing that I think we forget that when we welcome somebody in, that we're welcoming a whole human being, somebody that has fear, that has anger, that has chips on their shoulder, maybe a wound that is still very fresh. And so when we welcome them, we can't tell them take all of that and put that away, but you have to welcome that into the space too. And then I think the challenge, especially for pastors, is how do we prevent inclusion from being a license to perpetuate abuse?
Yes.
And that's where we move into from the shadow into the creative and trying to dance in that midst with all of that. And I think one of the ways we do that is by honoring the fact that we're wounded people, so that we can be, like Henry Allen said, become wounded healers.
Yes.
And part of being a healer is being sure that we create a container that allows for healing to take place, but also that makes it clear that abuse is not allowed in the container.
Right. I think you still have to have clear boundaries.
Yeah.
Uh, and you know, one of the questions that's come up in my community is, okay, we say we're inclusive of all, but if someone comes in who believes that Black people are inferior, or that gay people, that it's a sin to be gay, or something like that, do we tolerate that? And what I say is, look, everyone is welcome, but we don't just have wishy-washy beliefs. We have clear values that are stated, and we let it be known that those are our stated values. And if some of those views are articulated in a way that's just beyond saying this is what I believe, but actually does harm to others, then we have to draw a line and say, no, that is not allowed. For this to be a safe community, or even you to have a differing opinion, um, we can't allow any kind of harm to occur here. So yeah, there's a misnomer, I think, that inclusive communities, it means being wishy-washy. No, I think you have to be strong advocates for safe boundaries.
Yeah, and I even would, sometimes when people like that show up, I ask them, I'm like, why would you want to be in a place where you're filled with people who don't agree with you or believe what you believe? Because what we are holding up as our values are not opinions. They are our beliefs. They are what
Right.
give us life. And if these things don't give you life, what is your reason for being here?
That's
Um,
and that is the and that is an important question.
yeah,
And you know, an example of that would be early on when we became LGBTQ friendly. Since there were very few other churches in the Austin area that had done that at the time. I think only one other mainline church had done that. You had MCC and one other Lutheran church, ELCA Lutheran church, and us. And um, and so we would draw, but because we were Methodist, we would um, particularly attract um, gay and lesbian people who had a Methodist background. And every once in a while, someone would come in, and I had one incident where a person said, Sid, I really feel so welcome here as a gay man. I never dreamed that I could feel this. It's just so healing. Um, but I want to, I think I may have misunderstood you, but I got a feeling last Sunday when you were preaching that you don't believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God. And I said, no, I don't believe that. It's my mythological framework and my background. It's who we are as a congregation, but it doesn't mean that people who drink from other wells are somehow drinking from a different source. We're all we're all connected to that underground river. And he says, well, I just can't agree with that, and I don't think that you can be. I don't know how you can be Christian, call yourself Christian, and believe that other faith paths are acceptable. And I said to him, I don't think you're going to feel very welcome here, ultimately, because I'm not changing that viewpoint, and I'm not alone here. Um, and that person ultimately left because just because we were gay friendly didn't mean that we aligned in every other way. And so I think that there are always those challenges, and you just have to be true to yourself. Um, it's not that we said you have to go. It's not that we said you aren't welcome. It's just that we did, like you said, why would you stay here? Ultimately, if the belief system, if what we held to be true um, is not what you hold to be true. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it also brings up to me that, I think just because you're righteous in one area doesn't mean you're righteous in another area. That comes to mind. But also, it comes to mind that I think we often forget that religion is about 95% culture. Um, and most of the time we go to church because we just really like to be around people who think like us and look like us and love like us and eat the things we like. Because ultimately, I think our ego has been so fluffed up in our capitalist society that we get really affirmed by just reflections of ourselves.
Right.
You
Oh
know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. Uh, you can't be all things to all people, even
Yeah.
within the same tradition. And for me, it's um, the creation spirituality for those that have come with more traditional beliefs in either the UCC or the UMC have often found some of the things that we talk about in creation spirituality a little scary. Um, because we do talk about what Matthew Fox calls deep ecumenism, about um, inner spirituality or inner faith. We do talk about
Hmm.
that that all things are sacred. Uh, we changed a Tizay song that says it's "Come and Fill." You may know that song,
Yeah.
and it, and the original says, "Come and fill our hearts with your love. You alone, O Lord, uh, is holy." Well, that didn't fit with creation spirituality, so we changed it to uh, "Your whole world, O God, is holy," and that's how we sing it. There are some people that can't make that shift,
Yeah.
and don't get why you're saying that.
Yeah.
It is what it is.
Yeah, and I think we also sometimes create our own false binaries. In that, in your personal prayer life, you can certainly sing the song with Lord and reference to Christ and be Christocentric if you want. Um, you know, but when we're in a congregation, we don't pray the way that you want to pray. We pray the way that the body wants to pray. Um,
Exactly.
and that's how it happens. And yeah, I also think I try to hold compassion for people who can't do that, who can't broaden their understanding to be like that, because I do understand that it's again going to that shadow place, and having to confront that shadow, uh, and allowing it to open up into creative avenues, and that's very risky for people, and for some people it's very dangerous because their families can disown them, they can be
Right.
abused, they can
Oh
lose
yeah.
their job, their
Mm-hmm.
congregation. I think of Carlton Pearson, the very famous Pentecostal bishop who became um, a New Thought person. Uh, he lost everything.
Yeah.
Um, but he says, which is where I get that phrase, falling into grace. He talks about that. He didn't fall from grace, he fell into grace.
Into it. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And I just think, I pray often. Probably the number one prayer that I pray the most throughout my day and in my like ongoing life is I ask for the Spirit to often renew my my mind or renew my consciousness so that I can always be open to the particular way that God wants to manifest in the now. Um, Even if that challenges my theology, my way of praying, the language I use. You know, I'm still pretty stuck on the divine being human, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm also of the opinion. I think if God wants to act through the wind or be animist or whatever, that's up to God to decide. But you know, that's also I think too we need to get consent from God from what God wants to do.
Good idea.
So but uh well, we're coming to a close, but I want to really kind of pass the mic on to you in the next 5 to 8 minutes or so, and really let you say whatever is on your mind about you know, how you feel your life is manifesting throughout this pandemic and this crisis that we're living in, and what do you feel if you can put on your visionary hat, and you could cast a vision for what do you think that the horizon looks like? Oh, you know, above, beyond the horizon, what do you think that would look like?
Well, first of all, just let me say, I really have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't have a clue. I feel like that one of my favorite books of ministry has been a book by a fellow named William Bridges, who wrote a book called Transitions. And he says that we tend to think in terms of beginnings and endings, but life really, our experience of life is endings, neutral zone, or transition, and then beginnings, and that we have rituals and all sorts of language and stories around beginnings and endings, but we don't know what to do with the wilderness. We don't know what to do with the transition. And the Bible had a term for it. It was called 40. 40 days, 40 years, 40 days and nights of rain, you name it. It shows up over and over. And it is, it basically is a period of undefined chaos. And I feel like that we've had an ending in multiple layers. Some people have had deep endings where a loved one died, or multiple loved ones have died. Others have had it where they've not only died, but they couldn't be with them. And then we've had people lose jobs and security, and then there are those that have lost all confidence in whatever it is that they were doing and what could be coming. And one of the things that Bridges says in his book is that that even though the wilderness looks like chaos and is chaos, the building blocks for what is coming, or what will be birthed, is happening there. But it's all often subterranean. It's under the radar, and it's unknown, and looks like absolute chaos or even nothingness. I feel like that's where we are. So to project what that new beginning is going to be feels like folly to me at this point. But having said that, there are some things in this wilderness that feel a bit like Noah when he sent out the dove and got a twig back. He still had to wait for the waters to recede, and he landed wherever he landed. He didn't have a rudder, he didn't have a sail. He just landed wherever he was going to land, and that's how we're going to be. So even the twig doesn't really give us any pathway, but it does remind us that there's something out there. And I think that what I think is out there is perhaps a new way of connecting with each other. You've been doing this as someone committed to virtual ministry. This is nothing new for you. This is what you have you had the vision for this creatively already and have been applying it. For me, that's a whole new world. But so we're doing virtual worship, and each week we're learning things that we need to improve upon to make it flow better, and we're trying to figure out how to financially sustain our commitments to staff while during a period of COVID. We're trying to figure out how to support members who just need to get out there and protest, but who also are afraid because of COVID. So we're learning, and one of the things that we're seeing is that, and this is probably nothing new to you, but it's new to me. The number of people that tune into our worship over a week's period of time is about 3 times the number that we would have on a regular Sunday. Now, I don't know what that translates into. Maybe they're just coming on and checking it out. But each week we seem to have new people that we'd never heard of that are connecting with us. Mm-hmm. And we also have members that have long since moved away, that live in other parts of the country, that are watching us online and participating. We have one member who lives in Austin, whose mother lives in New Zealand. And one of the things that she loved doing with her mother when she was growing up was going to worship with her. Now her mother gets up in the middle of the night so they can watch worship together virtually at Trinity. And so what we're seeing is that even when we're able to come back together, and I don't know when that will be, we're going to do some sort of virtual connecting. Our Sunday school classes are meeting virtually. We're having other special classes that are meeting, support groups, small groups that are meeting. We're learning how to do this. It's not the same. It's not a hug. But it is. There was a need there, and we didn't realize it. Yeah. And so I think the twig that I've had land in my hand from the dove is that maybe some of the land that's out there is already here. Yeah. And we will need to continue to find some way of being connected virtually even after COVID. Yeah. So I'm hopeful. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it will look like. I think we're in those 40 days or 40 years of wilderness. So the new beginning is not clear, but I do see some signs that the building blocks of what lies ahead are being formed right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think of, you have an affinity for the wolf. And I think of oftentimes when we think of the wolf, we think of the wolf as a solitary animal. But in reality, even if you see a wolf on its own, its pack is always nearby.
Sure.
And I think that is a reality that we're being pushed into, that we need to always remember that we have a pack, and our pack might need to be a little bit more intentional about being present, showing up for us. And yes. But also I think recognize the importance of knowing that we're not a singular entity all to our own. We're not our own stories. Even if we've actively crafted our own narratives, while those narratives are beautiful on their own, they are only one sentence in an ongoing story that's still unfolding, and the universe is helping write that for us.
One of the things that I really miss is that we have a thriving children's program at Trinity, and on a given most Sundays we have between 30 and 40 kids there in worship. And one of the things that our children's program instigated some time back is that we have 3 stations for communion, which we do the first Sunday of the month. And for some time now, we have been pairing an older adult in the congregation with a child, and they are the servers of that station. Usually the child is holding the chalice, and the older adult is passing out the bread. But there's something powerful about being in worship together when in that kind of intergenerational dynamic. And no matter how much we are becoming proficient and smoother in our virtual worship, I am missing that kind of connection tremendously. It had created a big full place, and now that place feels empty. So, I'm hopeful, but I'm still not seeing my pack in the same dynamic that I was seeing.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot, being birthed right now. There's a lot being kind of passed on, and it's rough to give birth. Ask any person that's given birth; it's painful. And so I think, many of us are being called to be midwives to this new reality. And part of that practice of midwifery is easing some of that tension, easing some of that pain. I like to think of Mary Magdalene, who anointed the feet of Christ with the oil and her tears and her hair. And just that, I think, we're being encouraged to not be afraid of intimacy. And how the world is doing that is by taking those ways of being intimate away from us and trying to teach us the worth of it, because we're really trying to be reintroduced to intimacy in a way that we really see its divine power.
Interesting. And I do think that is truly one of the things that we're experiencing. Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah. So, well, Sid, this has been so much fun. I really, really appreciate your time. Yeah, and your life and your way of being in the world is very helpful to me. And do you mind ending with a prayer or a word that's on your heart?
The word that comes to mind is actually came from something you said a moment ago, being midwives. And I thought of Meister Eckhart's statement that God is lying on a maternity bed for eternity, giving birth to the Son of God, giving birth to the new life, and I think that those of us who are mystics and prophets and artists are in that midwifery of that divine birth, and so truly that is where we are. So yeah, I'll say a prayer. Holy One, who is found nowhere but is everywhere, remind us, even in a pandemic, even in the midst of crazy political chaos, even in the midst of protests that remind us of the original sin of racism in this country, even in the midst of our own anxieties and fears, even in the midst of this wilderness, these 40 days of rain, even in this time, you call on us to be your midwives of divinity. Lead us in that and give us eyes for seeing and hands for healing and courage for doing. We pray this in your many names. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, again, thank you, Sid, and it's been so much fun, and I look forward to all the work that we're going to do together still.
Me too.
Before you retire, but even when you retire, don't think I'm not going to be calling you.
I'll retire from my job of being a pastor, but I won't retire from ministry. That's just who I am.
Yeah, you're going to be refired, like Matt says.
Refired, as Matt says. Yeah, I like that term. Yeah. I may need to be retired for a little bit, before I'm refired. I may need 40 days.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, but I do like the idea of eventually of refiring. That's good.